All right, we'll go ahead and get started. As you probably noticed, we've changed things a little bit this year. And I think it makes a lot of sense to start the new school year by celebrating innovation, especially innovation in our Catholic schools, and encouraging and inspiring faculty to use innovative thinking to reach our students. We also want to find individuals who can speak on the topics related to that theme. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 2022 Mass of the Holy Spirit keynote speaker, Dr. Dustyn Ragasa. Dr. Ragasa is an assistant professor of philosophy and religious studies and director of the Master of Pastoral Theology program at Chaminade University of Honolulu. Born and raised on the island of Kauai, he was honored to return to alma mater as a member of the faculty in 2019 after earning his PhD in ethics and social theory at the Graduate Theological Union at the University of California, Berkeley. His areas of research and academic interests include Aretaic ethics of Aristotelian Thomistic school, and I have a PhD. Constitutive moral luck and action theory. As director of the Master of Pastoral Theology program, he also has the privilege to oversee the academic program for the formation of permanent deacons in the Diocese of Honolulu. The title of his presentation is The Confluence of Knowing, Medieval Wisdom for Our Contemporary Prospect. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dustyn Ragasa.
I just recently learned that I and myself, both of your superintendents, are all Kauai people. And so I'm very proud to be here with the Kauai people on the rise. I'm so grateful to be here with you on this day in this place. First on this place, the last time I was in this building, I was here for a wake for my childhood pastor, Father Christopher Keahi, whom doubtless many of you knew. He was the first person to hand on to me an adult faith, a thinking faith, a critical faith. He was the person who taught me that people come first, and I'm always grateful for that. I was raised by the Sacred Hearts, and although I'm a Marianist educator now, my heart will always be Sacred Hearts, and so I'm glad to be at home. But with people like you, there wasn't a day that went by in the pandemic that my colleagues at Chaminade didn't think with wonder and awe of all that you do. We have no idea how you did it, and we are humbled by your sacrifice, your talent, your courage, in overcoming tremendous odds given the situation. I've never had an opportunity to thank you for that, so thank you. And do know that even though I'm speaking here, I am well cognizant of the fact that I am standing among giants. Generations will remember what you've done, and you have our gratitude. Okay. So the title of my talk today is The Confluence of Knowing, Medieval Wisdom for Our Contemporary Project. I wrote it out mostly for protection for you, because I don't want you going home with 3 credits you didn't sign up for. So here we are. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the specter of epistemological exceptionalism, a dismissal of knowing. Aristotle begins his metaphysics by saying, all human beings by their nature desire to know. And I suspect that's why we are all here today. Somewhere along your way, your journey began with desire to know. That desire ultimately led you to become scholars and students, and ultimately teachers. At some point, we were confronted with the task of unpacking with critical eyes the breadth of human experience. And a big part of this was discovering not only that there were different things to know, but that there are different ways of knowing them. Throughout history, numerous ways of knowing have been identified by philosophers, social scientists, theologians, poets, engineers, just about all of us who think about thinking. The empirical, for example, can be summarized as a way of knowing funded by the observable, organized into a cohesive whole which enables explanation and prediction. Rationalism, on the other hand, points to a way of knowing independent of experience. Intuition manifests a knowledge attained through sudden awareness without prior experience, perhaps rooted in the subconscious. And faith reaches beyond all of this, drawing its sense of knowing through an ineffable experience of the transcendent. The list of ways of knowing goes on. Just as our different senses enable us to perceive a broad range of stimuli, different ways of knowing enable us to perceive the polyvalent complexity of existence. But I like to put my finger on something going on in our milieu. I'm actually on the same frequency and wavelength as Bishop Larry was in his homily today. I'd like to appeal to your experience, the experience of every person sitting here today. Have you ever noticed a growing sentiment that only a few ways of knowing seem to matter, or that some ways of knowing matter more than others? To put it bluntly, have you ever felt like some people are living in their own world where empirical, scientific facts don't matter? Have you ever seen someone claim that indigenous knowledge is somehow less than Western knowledge? Have you ever heard someone argue that religious belief isn't true because it can't be proved? If you haven't, count yourself lucky. I want to hide where you're hiding. Speaking for myself as one who loves scientific, indigenous, Western, religious things, this is regrettable stuff. Next slide, please. Thank you. We presently live in a context within which it is common and seemingly acceptable to grant broad authority to a single way of knowing. It is as if just one way of knowing is exceptional, and exceptional not in a positive sense. Perhaps it is more accurate to speak of it as an exceptional ism. As a genuine ism, it functions as an ideology which at once informs and restricts the way in which we experience our world. Because we're talking about the structure and evaluation of knowledge, the domain of epistemology, let's call this tendency to accept only one way of knowing epistemological exceptionalism. My definition of epistemological exceptionalism on the next slide, or if you please click the button. Oh, sorry, back one. Oh, okay, not there. I identify it as, here's an epistemic moment. Epistemological exceptionalism then acknowledges veracity on the basis of only one form of knowing to the exclusion of others. This might sound a bit hyperbolic, but I think this phenomenon is more pervasive than some of us would like to admit or acknowledge. We probably know people who think like that. They say, I don't trust science, it's all about control. I don't care about religion, I believe in evidence. I don't believe in evidence, I believe in my gut. I don't believe in my gut, I believe in science. Lather, rinse, and repeat. In this view, the different ways of knowing are adversarial. They're not complementary. They don't help us to unlock the nature of reality more fully. Rather, different ways of knowing present a cacophony of cognitive dissonances, drowning out the sweet, solitary melody of truth. But in this view, there's only one true way of knowing. The rest is just noise. In one form or another, the narrative of epistemological exceptionalism has been reinforced for centuries. Regrettably, it's our focus in our time has to pit empiricism against all other forms of knowing. We observe the conflict between faith versus science as emblematic of this oppositional dynamic. We also identify within this trend empirical scientism, an ideology of reductionism, which would have us jettison the transcendent, reducing all of this to basic physical processes, mechanical, chemical, or otherwise. This reductionism even appears in popular culture. You might recognize these two women. Two examples come to mind. In the film Contact, there on your left, a scientist named Dr. Arroway, portrayed by Jodie Foster, searches for evidence of intelligent life elsewhere in the galaxy. She identifies a faraway planet as a point of interest and helps to develop a machine capable of taking her there. Her experience is traveling through the wormhole and encountering other than human beings. Some of you might remember that scene. But the experience of those on the ground is very different. The machine failed to transport her anywhere. She just simply fell through in the blink of an eye. An inquiry goes on to dismiss her evidence because it wasn't empirically provable. And ultimately, it actually was, but no spoilers here. And so contact demonstrates a trend within it. Experience itself must be confirmed by the empirical. More recently, Interstellar, on the right, portrays a mission to find new habitable planets for human colonization. Doctors Brand and Edmonds share an intense emotional bond. Dr. Brand, seen there, somehow knew that her partner, Dr. Edmonds, had found a habitable planet despite his radio silence. When asked to defend her insistence that the mission investigate the planet discovered by Edmonds, she is unable to provide direct justifying evidence. She states, "Love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space." It is her love which tells her that Edmonds is alive, that he has found a habitable planet. But that love was not enough to convince others, who reject it as her own way of knowing. This one I will spoil. Her love was right. Therein lies the function of epistemological exceptionalism, to inform and restrict the way in which we experience our world, such that the sole arbiter of truth is one's chosen way of knowing. It is one thing to privilege one way of knowing over others, but it's quite another to deny outright the legitimacy of other ways of knowing. There's nothing necessary about the basic structure of knowledge that forces one to think in this way, nor is the apparent opposite of epistemological exceptionalism, I'm talking about relativism, a better solution. I hope to address this phenomenon with you today by examining a different anomaly in our culture, and this strategy is going to look like a brief divergence. I would like to suggest that these are two branches of but one solitary phenomenon. My aim this morning is to revisit with you an approach that has served our intellectual tradition well in the past. I think it has something to say to us in our increasingly epistemologically divided world and time. To cultivate this kind of approach within our students might empower them to be greater beholders of a broader, richer, and more benevolent world. It might help us as teachers to be extra vigilant in seeking out the particular gifts that each student brings to our learning communities. My message today is one of optimism and hope. At its core, it is one of true belief in each of you and all that you are in Catholic educators. My hope is to show that our medieval tradition, despite the fact that it occurred about 1,000 years ago, is just as innovative today as it ever was. 2, the pluralistic society and the loss of the common good, the call for intellectual solidarity. We occupy an interesting moment in human history. The finely tuned machinery of Western cosmopolitan pluralism is in full swing. We enjoy an unthinkably great variety of cultures, conceptions of life, foods, world religions, languages, senses of taste, you name it. Part of the genius of this pluralism has been its purposeful creation of a space for everyone. Diversity is celebrated and encouraged. Personal authenticity is recognized as an important value. Mutual respect is key. Differing viewpoints are to be heard. Our milieu has enabled our society to better appreciate the different identities, stories, and abilities of our people. We certainly can, and we certainly will do better as the year goes on to help people, more people, to feel seen, included, and appreciated. A key ingredient which makes this level of diversity and pluralism possible is tolerance. Tolerance. Jesuit social ethicist David Hollenbach notes that tolerance is a most American solution to the potential conflicts caused by pluralism. American flavored tolerance is quite intuitive for us. It is something that most of us have been taught since a very young age. You live your life how you want, I live my life how I want. I won't tread on your turf if you don't tread on my turf. As Hollenbach summarizes, tolerance implies that if people would just leave each other alone, everybody would be better off. My public responsibility in a community marked by tolerance is therefore an important but very modest one. I'm supposed to leave others alone. And in my attempt to leave them alone, my sole responsibility is civility. All I owe to others is a basic honesty, a basic kindness. My duty is simply to let others be, unless they cause harm to me. We have formed a social agreement of sorts, to live and to let live, to leave alone and be left alone. In our context, clearing a public tolerant space for pluralism means that opinions and their expressions are to be carefully circumscribed, lest they infringe upon the opinions and expressions of others. That which is to be protected by tolerance, think religion, personal beliefs, lifestyle persuasions, and so forth, become a private matter. I can believe whatever I want so long as I keep it to myself. In this way, the basic structure of society is to remain permeable to anyone, regardless of their conception of life, their preferences, or their value commitments. This privatization of certain aspects of life seems to be a very small price to pay for the freedom to live in the manner that one would like to choose. However, a certain strain of tolerance can also facilitate a kind of individualist insularism. Bishop Larry talked about that today. A detachment from the other who holds different views or practices a different kind of lifestyle. Leaving alone and being left alone naturally means that we have fewer opportunities for encounter with those who hold different points of view. And yet, on account of our human nature, we want to be with like people. And so, in the insular society, the person goes out to look for people like them, and they find people exactly like them. Next slide, please. This is a fertile ground for the seed of the so-called lifestyle enclave, typical of contemporary America. It was described by Berkeley sociologists Robert Bellah and one of my doctoral advisors, Ann Swidler. The lifestyle enclave functions as an appropriate form of collective support in an otherwise radically individualing society. They say it celebrates the narcissism of similarity, insulated from other realities around them. These lifestyle enclaves are, in a word, a hermetically sealed bubble of like-minded people. Now, most of us recognize this dynamic. Think about the lifestyles of people around you. Do they all tend to stick together? Do they all drive the same cars? Do they have the same political beliefs? Do they frequent the same restaurants, watch the same TV shows? Do they share a particular culture? Do they occupy the same income bracket? Do they avoid people who are different, purposely or subconsciously? Chances are, if yes, they're living in a lifestyle enclave. I know I have at certain points in my life. This is a Richmond Marina. Has anybody been here? It's a pretty enclave-y sort of place. Now, I'm not talking about being from the west side or the east side. The associate superintendent told me she's from Kapa'a, and being a west sider, I was like, ooh. I'm not talking about that. I'm kidding. It's about the fact that we often share a specific location, yet have really nothing to do with others, except just a few others, exactly like ourselves. Quick story. This is why I wrote it out, because I'm all vala'au. After I got out of the rehearsal yesterday, I called my mother, because Auntie Mandy, I'll tell you why I'm calling her that in a second, told me that she knew my mom, and I called my mom. I said, hey, you know who this person? Yeah, of course, our families go back, so on and so forth. Anyway, by the end of that conversation, my mother said it was not Mandy, but Auntie Mandy, so sorry, Auntie Mandy. Hollenbach notes that this dark underbelly of tolerance is not a sustainable social model, certainly not the lifestyle enclave. Consider urban poverty. He suggests that the plight of the poor is often no perceived concern of the more affluent, insularized classes. Poverty is a problem for thee, not for me. I'm just minding my own business, and there's no reason for me to get involved. In this way, lifestyle enclaves often reinforce poverty by insulating members from one from another. Enclaves often help to marginalize lower strata by pushing the other into underserved inner cities. Upward mobility into the middle class is stunted. Access to high-quality services is difficult. When I think about this, the lifestyle enclave, when I think about people being pushed into the inner cities, I think about my time in San Francisco. But this isn't something that's just happening on the continent. It's happening here. Think about the places that come to mind when I say the word gentrification. That, whatever came to mind when I said gentrification, that is what Hollenbach is hinting at when he talks about the construction of walls and moats, zoning ordinances, expensive establishments and the like, which separates one group of people from another. These walls and moats are designed, according to Hollenbach, to strengthen the locks that protect the privileged from those who are different. Hollenbach's primary suggestion here is that the longevity of this form of economic inequality is in part due to a preference of tolerance over the common good. Tolerance tolerates disparities. It tolerates insularism. It tolerates atomization. And it leads to the loss of that which is common, the foundation for a sense of community. Tolerance again says that we would all be okay if you stayed in your place and I stay in mine. But as Hollenbach argues, tolerance is not an adequate stance if we hope to address the isolation and despair of the inner city poor. Urban poverty demonstrates that leaving others to fail alone is not conducive to a truly healthy society within which each person is respected, valued, and loved. Ending class isolation is a task for which tolerance is not the answer. That is a task for the common good, which needs to be recovered from the absence of a common agreement on the content of a good life. It is only then, says Hollenbach in the Catholic social teaching tradition, that we will be able to identify a minimum threshold for the well-being of each member of our society. We are well aware of the difficulties of articulating this in our pluralistic and divided world. Misappropriations of pluralism has sometimes hastened an eclipse of that which is common. Differences have been magnified, cultivated, weaponized, absolutized. This has had the effect of calling into question whether or not the common good has a place in our society today. Despite this atmosphere, Hollenbach continues to insist upon the common good. He calls for an open dialogue across the enclaves for the purpose of imagining and negotiating the basic parameters of society. He grounds his project in a term that he says intellectual solidarity, which he defines as a spirit of willingness to take other persons and groups seriously enough to engage them in conversation and debate about how the interdependent world we share should be shaped and structured. Intellectual solidarity is the opposite of tolerance. It's an antidote to this poison. Whereas tolerance emphasizes leaving each other alone, intellectual solidarity calls for the engaging of the other through listening and speaking in the hope that understanding might replace incomprehension, and that perhaps even agreement about the good we share could be had in common. In a society where such dynamics are present, it is time for the eclipsed notion of the common good to emerge out from the umbra cast by a detached, atomistic individualism. In the process of eliminating marginalization, the insularism of the lifestyle enclave must be broken open. Ending the enclave mentality is a fundamental element of reclaiming the social interdependence consistent with our tradition's notion of solidarity, integral development. And I believe that this very quest to dismantle the lifestyle enclave has something to say to our intellectual climate today. In the light of the preceding, my suggestion to you today is simple. We're getting to the exciting part. Our present intellectual context parallels the social phenomenon described by Bella and Switler, often aided by the dark underbelly of tolerance as identified by Hollenbach. Consider the detached insularist logic of the enclave. In the lifestyle enclave, pockets of the like-minded form an exclusive community, marginalize the other, and indeed actively undermine the participation of the other in public discourse on the good life. In an intellectual enclave, one might imagine pockets of the like-minded forming an exclusive thought community, marginalizing other forms of knowing, and actively undermining the participation of these other forms in knowing the common human intellectual enterprise. It's not my aim here to suggest that there is a causal nature, a causal relationship between the two. It may very well be the case that social phenomena structure personal phenomena, but my proposal is much more modest. The logic of the enclave is the same, but its presentation has shifted its focus from the social to the intellectual. In this way, the eclipse of the common has also affected our intellectual setting. Knowledge itself, but more precisely, forms of knowing, have been eclipsed. We are forced to acknowledge this reality daily. Our intellectual climate is as such that we can't agree on what truth or truthfulness is. The effect is a loss of a common narrative. We have no agreement on the parameters and specifics of a basic sense of truthfulness. No basis for shareable truth claims beyond one's own intellectual enclave. So this notion that I'm proposing to you today of intellectual enclaves, if they exist, and I believe they do, might help explain why forms of knowing are being marginalized, suppressed, and excluded from broader dialogue. It may be why other forms of knowing simply seem to matter less. We might learn from the lifestyle enclave why the intellectual enclave must be dismantled for the flourishing of our society. Next slide, please. Thank you. Given our context, I think what is needed is a kind of intellectual solidarity. Let's review Hollenbach's original articulation in a social context. He says it's a spirit of willingness to take on other persons and groups seriously enough to engage them in conversation and debate about how the interdependent world we share should be shaped and structured. A version responsive to our intellectual climate today might read, a spirit of willingness to take other forms of knowledge and their custodians seriously enough to engage them in conversation and debate about how the world we share could be made more completely intelligible. In other words, my flavor of intellectual solidarity has four aims. First, to propose that the intellectual enclave needs to be broken open. Second, to take seriously the different ways of knowing, whether that be faith, intuition, rationalism, whatever. They have something to contribute to an integral conception of society. Third, to foster a conversation between the different forms of knowing. And finally, to dare to unlock or better appreciate the broader structure of reality, frankly too large and too complex to be exhausted by any single form of knowing. So in this next section, I'd like to review with you a powerful contribution toward these aims for our intellectual tradition. Our own intellectual community, if you're in this room, I'm talking about you. We've grappled with this problem before, namely tensions between different ways of knowing and the conflict that accompanies this. And that process yielded the edgiest, most innovative, and exciting period of discovery. I'm talking about the Middle Ages. Now, it often happens that people have all sorts of weird conceptions when I say that I'm a medieval person. They think I'm interested in dragons and wizards and jousting and eating turkey legs with your bare hands and blue-faced Mel Gibson fighting the English for freedom. Well, yeah, but there's so much more to that. The medieval period was a time of tremendous intellectual diversity, just like us now, caused by an explosion of discovery and innovation. It informed a distinctively Catholic method of open, disciplined inquiry, truly a golden period of intellectual ferment. Again, I think this period and the wisdom that our intellectual ancestors can give to all of us has something to say to you here and now. But first, a little bit of background. Between 800 and 1500, our community induced a mass expulsion of the Jewish and Muslim communities from the Iberian Peninsula. We have a lot of reason to look back at this period, now often called the Reconquista of Spain, with some regret. At that time, Jews and Muslims were the preeminent scholars of the day, not us. They left behind, as they left Spain, Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, vast libraries. The Reconquistadores quickly uncovered texts left behind by these scholars. And unlike other parts of the West, the scholars had been studying Aristotle, and other Greek philosophy, as they had been transmitted through Arabic scholars. For the first time, they possessed philosophical texts that had been banned by the early Christians and by emperors. In Toledo, Gerard of Cremona and other scholars made available in Latin from the Arabic Aristotle's texts on biology, physics, logic, semantics, ethics, and so forth. This body of work, among other things, ultimately empowered a more robust foundation of natural philosophy. Today, we just call it science. A Dominican, good to see the Dominicans here, Albert of Cologne, was on the cutting edge of a lot of this research taking place at the University of Paris. The texts were released as they were translated in little digests. Everybody was watching it like a mini-series. People binged as if it were new episodes of The Office, and everyone was reading this philosophy. As one might imagine, at times, this influx of new information introduced a considerable tension into the academic status quo. How did it fit in? How did this new Aristotelian thought brought to us by the Muslims fit into the Christian worldview? Does it have value? Is it to be rejected? All of these possibilities were considered. Predictably, some embraced this new material. Others saw it as directly contrary to Christianity, better left in the past. To say that there was disagreement over the value of Aristotle is to make an understatement. Yet some insisted that Aristotle should be studied and examined. Those who saw value in the newly recovered Aristotelian texts needed to somehow square him with the tradition, our tradition, especially when his work conflicted with scripture and tradition. In the early days of trying to resolve these conflicts, the scholastics turned to one of their classic resources, namely the Sic et Non of Peter Abelard. Abelard acknowledges that passages from the early fathers often contradict, often spectacularly so. Making sense of these contradictions, especially when they related to the interpretation of Scripture, was an incredibly important task. The prologue to Sic et Non offers some pointers for resolution. Consider the different sense meanings of the words over which there is a disagreement. Reflect on the plain meaning of the word. Consider the relative weight and authority of the disagreeing authors. Examine whether a father might have been working with a corrupted text, corrupted by a heretic. But above all, says Abelard, admit that the thoughts of holy people might be beyond you if you cannot come to understand it. The rest of Sic et Non reads a collection of apparently contradictory statements, which Abelard himself does not resolve. Sic et Non is actually a pedagogical tool. It's a workbook. It's a collection of problem sets by which a student could learn to resolve disagreements between competing patristic commentaries. The legacy of Abelard's workbook, pondered over by generations of students, was a heightened capacity of the medieval mind to find congruity between different authorities by carefully delineating and clarifying senses of words or ideas. And this skill enabled the medievals to perform exceptionally complicated syntheses. Subsequent generations developed even more nuanced methods of syntheses. The method attributed to Albert of Cologne's most prodigious student, Thomas of Aquino, is a short, unassuming 6-word phrase. Seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. That would become emblematic of the period and continues to function in modern scholasticism. And I don't know about you, if any of you have heard this before, but I hadn't heard of this until I went to grad school. I was convinced then, as I am now, that seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish is one of the bits of our intellectual heritage that our world could use in the process of innovation. In a few moments, I will submit to you that seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish is a tradition's powerful resource to which I had alluded in our work to dismantle the intellectual enclave. Let me offer some reflections on what I think this means and how it could enable us and our students perform better as scholars and teachers. First, seldom affirm. Seldom affirm implies a healthy skepticism, a reluctance to jump on an interlocutor's bandwagon. In dialogue, our search for truth is rarely completed by simply accepting wholesale what somebody else is telling us. Points of view, however compelling or bewitching they might be, need to be carefully combed for elements of value. It's those elements that are to be affirmed, and only long evaluation of the position. In so doing, we recognize the contingency of knowledge, acknowledging that no human being could possibly hand to us neatly packaged truth, unadulterated by the finitude of our minds. No ordinary human being, that is. And so seldom affirm is a call to develop a critical eye that can distinguish between that which is authentic and that which is superficially attractive. We tend to call this critical thinking in our work, and it is a crucial skill for our students to develop. Seldom affirm maintains a healthy hermeneutics of suspicion, one that is not just simply critique, but one that is affirming. In my own journey, I became a Thomist not because Thomism is a brand that I covet, not because Thomism is an old idea, not because Thomism is central to our tradition. Rather, Thomas of Aquinas's thought persists as a distinctive school of thought precisely because it is well-reasoned. And so where contemporary Thomists engage his texts, we do so with a discerning eye, given all that we've learned in dialogue with the other disciplines, especially science. In studying him critically as he studied his predecessors critically, our critiques and the affirmation it enables honors and continues the spirit of the work he began nearly a millennium ago. Second, never deny. I remember one day, it was a very hot Berkeley day, near the end of a graduate seminar on the natural law. It met at 8 a.m. It was brutal. One of our brightest classmates delivered an epic intervention. It was compelling, it was florid, it was provocative, and her passion stunned the room. My professor, a Dominican priest, paused and said, "For my entire academic career, I've been opposing just the argument that you are now advancing. I am open to the possibility that you will be the person to change my mind." That was a teachable moment on many levels, but a masterclass in giving others charitable reading. Never deny, the second clause states. This is a fundamental call to receptivity to the thoughts of others. Without it, dialogue cannot begin. Never deny is a humility before the possible. It is a posture of taking another seriously enough so as to not dismiss them outright, no matter how fruitless their position might appear to be. Never deny is a reminder to resist that basic reflex, to write off what is different or novel. It is an invitation to turn sleep mode off, to clear the keyword filter, to unmute the contact. This disposition behind never deny is a gateway to the disposition of wanting to understand. Taking one's blinders off can be scary, we admit this. It can reveal prejudices that we never admitted in ourselves. But in turn, we will be rewarded with an opportunity for encounter, as Pope Francis calls it. It is here in the encounter that, in truly hearing and seeing the viewpoints of others, we help to restore and protect their dignity as thinkers, as dreamers, as imaginers, as they endeavor to plumb the depths of reality just as imperfectly as we do. There is another side of never deny that never gets any airtime. Never deny also informs how we are to interact with our own tradition, to not shy away from our commitments, our values, our basic identities, and our process of inquiry. At least two sides are needed in the process of dialogue, in the process of encounter. Being true to one's intellectual community, representing it well, not denying its influence is a key ingredient in a flourishing intellectual community. When encountering Aristotelianism as it was handed down through Islam, the medievals didn't abandon their beliefs to become Muslims. Rather, they allowed that experience to empower them to become better Christians. Never deny must go both ways, and when it does, intellectual integrity is present. And so the more I reflect on my professor's words, the more I realize how powerfully it embodies the spirit of never deny. I am open to the possibility of you being the person to change my mind. Third and finally, always distinguish. In my opinion, always distinguish was a crowning jewel of this method, though perhaps the most opaque. Again, I'd like to appeal to your experience. All of us, at some point or another, have gotten into terrible arguments, conversations that started off with a very strong disagreement. Over time, and as you blew off some steam, you realized that you both had just been going around in circles. Turns out that you had largely agreed all along. Turns out that you were using different words to express a similar idea, or simply began to defend the same idea from different starting points. Maybe your pride and desire had stopped you from seeing common ground. But through asking questions of clarification, you ultimately realized that your two streams of thought did not diverge, but converged. Perhaps the argument provided both of you an opportunity to fill in the gaps in your own thinking, to reconsider the formulation of your ideas. In the best case scenario, you left that argument with a new ally, somebody who deeply understands what you're trying to say and help you to clarify your ideas. That is what distinguish hopes to enable us to do. As Abelard noted, multiple senses of a single word can be the origin of tension between apparently contradictory statements. By making careful distinctions and debate, consensus-friendly clarity can result. In a word, clarity begets consensus. The result is a fuller, more complex conception than has been uncovered through just one process. We might call it hair-splitting, but they thought of it as a crucial tool in the synthesis and uncovering of knowledge. In our times, we might say that people are comparing apples and oranges, but to the medieval mind, an apple and orange can be meaningfully compared as fruit. This magnificent medieval intellectual achievement enabled nuanced ideas, which drew their strength from a plurality of seemingly incompatible resources. At this point, perhaps the best I can do is provide a quick example, quite naturally, from my field of philosophical ethics. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, anybody read it? Oh, run out to the store and get it right after you get out today. It's a page turner, I promise. It's particularly interesting as part of the greater debate on what makes for a fulfilled, meaningful, satisfied human life. However, there was a small kind problem with this. In the Ethics, Aristotle identifies happiness as a fulfillment of human nature, identified with the living of life according to reason, in a word, virtue. This was in seeming conflict with the Christian understanding of human fulfillment revealed by God and Jesus the Christ as resting in him alone. Faced with this tension, Thomas needed to square between the two or to choose between them, Scripture or Aristotle. On the one hand, his commentary on the Ethics demonstrates considerable faith in the thought of the pagan, reason-based Aristotle. He did believe that the Greeks enjoyed a certain level of happiness. On the other hand, he holds firm to flourishing as fulfillment in God as revealed in Scripture and as articulated by our church fathers. His goal is to respect the weight of revelation as well as appropriate, or at least appreciate, Aristotelian thought. And so Thomas goes through this process. Seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. How does he do it? Well, he does not accept Aristotle's teaching wholesale. He has trouble with the notion of a purely here and now fulfillment. What I tell my undergrads is the hashtag YOLO sense of happiness. But Thomas does not also deny that Aristotle had critical insight into the nature of human flourishing. Nor does Thomas deny the authority of revelation, that true human fulfillment is in God alone. To resolve this, he introduces a critical distinction. He acknowledges that the two understandings of fulfillment are compatible. Happiness, according to Aristotle, identified through the rational life and expressed through the life of virtue, is true but imperfect happiness. Perfect happiness is only attained in seeing God face to face, attainable only through salvation as won for us by Jesus the Christ. In so doing, Thomas distinguishes between two aspects of one integral sense of human flourishing. In so doing, Thomas has meaningfully synthesized two apparently contradictory traditions through the power of seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. He rejects a temptation to turn inward, to become insular, to flee the wisdom of the other. In short, he had dared to dismantle and bridge the intellectual enclaves of his day to provide a holistic, common account of human fulfillment. Always distinguish was a doorway for the distinctive medieval drive to search for authentic truth wherever it was to be found. This third element was the greatest tool of the cosmopolitan medieval mind of disciplined inquiry. Nearly every scholastic text, every text from medieval ages, is a lesson in how to think pluralistically, testaments to the power of the medieval mind in making sense of multiple points of view. This period yielded thought highly textured by different experiences and worldviews of people sometimes in conflict. Thomas succeeds in bringing diversity together when it was not easy. A teacher of mine compares him to a party host who works hard to get people deeply at odds with each other to have a good time, all the while concealing how hard they have to work to do it. How does he do it? Again, drawing distinctions. Clarity begets consensus. For us today, always distinguish is a reminder to always seek clarity, to resist the temptation to paint with broad strokes, to never oversimplify the positions of our dialogue partners, to recognize that there is a chance that we might be reaching at the same thing, to be aware that we all have something unique to contribute to our shared understanding of human reality. We simply need to be clear about what we're talking about before we can build meaningful bridges. And I think you'd agree with me that is something we need in our world today. So, to conclude, I want to bring us back to where we began, now through the lens of all of these preceding comments. I want you to recall the marginalization of certain ways of knowing today and a broader tendency toward the insularism which enabled that. Many of us probably cannot remember a more divided world, where pockets of people lived in their alternate world of alternate facts, entirely dismissive of whole groups of intellectuals, of traditions, of religions, of communities, and their distinctive ways of knowing. Most of us might be afraid of living in such uncharted waters, but I want to assure everyone that there is nothing new under the sun. I've tried to suggest that we find ourselves in a situation not too different from Thomas's time. Thomas did not just tolerate this contribution from Judaism and Islam in the person of Aristotle. Instead, he sought to find common ground, a confluence, if I may, which might make for a fuller and more complete conception of reality. In his work on Aristotle, Thomas teaches us how to navigate difference, guided by a faith that a confluence of different ways of knowing can signal profound intellectual promise. And so, my colleagues, perhaps we do well to use his wisdom as we construct our own discourses to dismantle the intellectual enclave today. Seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. We recall that this is an invitation to consider the unitary nature of reality from different points of view, using different data, seeing with different lenses, constantly being aware of the multiplicity of value. We acknowledge with Thomas that outright denial of different ways of knowing closes us off from different elements of human experience. The only way to overcome this insularism is by cultivating a sense of humility before the experience of others. We are reminded that it is in looking for authentic confluence between our experiences that we are likely to build bridges and form places for true dialogue. And so when we all go back to begin the noble work of forming our students for a self-sustaining intellectual life, let's remind them that it's faith and reason, feelings and data, indigenous and Western, ancient and modern, heart and mind. In this way, we will help them recover the value of different ways of knowing as they go about the hard work of synthesizing their own coherent picture of reality. I've tried to show you this morning that our intellectual provides us with a powerful tool, much more profound than meets the eye. It is my hope that in our mission to educate, we will cultivate students with an ever greater capacity to seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. And when they do, it will be their gift to a world in desperate need of things common and shared.